The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Joe's diner as Harold Thompson settled into his usual corner booth. At 93 years old, his daily routine was as much a part of him as the medals that adorned his old military vest. The small bell above the door chimed at exactly 7:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 15 years. "Your usual, Harold?" Sarah, a waitress who had been serving him since she was in high school, called out with a warm smile. Her red hair was starting to show streaks of gray, but her eyes still sparkled with the same kindness they always had. Harold nodded, his weathered hand smoothing down his carefully pressed shirt. "Yes, please, Sarah. And maybe an extra slice of toast today." His voice was soft but clear, carrying the dignity that came from a lifetime of service. The diner was quiet at this hour, just the way Harold liked it. A few regular customers sat scattered around the room. Mr. Peterson reading his morning paper, Mrs. Rodriguez enjoying her daily cup of green tea, and young Tommy from the gas station grabbing breakfast before his shift. The gentle hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of coffee cups and the sizzle of bacon from the kitchen created a peaceful symphony Harold had come to love. As he waited for his breakfast, Harold's eyes drifted to the photographs on the wall. Each one told a story of the small town's history, and he could remember when most of them were taken. His favorite was a black and white image from 1952, showing the diner on its opening day. He had been there, though few would recognize the young soldier in his pressed uniform standing proudly in the background. Sarah returned with his coffee, placing it carefully on the table. "Here you go, Harold. Just the way you like it. Black with 1 sugar." She paused, noticing him studying the old photographs. "You know, my grandfather used to tell me stories about how different this place was back then." Harold smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "It was different times, Sarah. Simpler in some ways, harder in others." He reached for his coffee cup, his hand steady despite his age. The warmth of the mug brought comfort, like an old friend's handshake. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the slightly dusty windows and catching the medals on Harold's vest. Each one had a story, tales of bravery, sacrifice, and brotherhood that he kept close to his heart. Most days, the other customers would simply nod respectfully at the decorated veteran, understanding that some stories were too deep to share over morning coffee. Outside, the town was slowly coming to life. Cars passed by on Main Street, their drivers heading to work or running early morning errands. The flower shop across the street was just opening, and Harold watched as Mrs. Bailey arranged her colorful display of spring blooms. Everything was following its usual pattern, just as it had countless mornings before. Then came the rumble. At first, it was distant, a low growl that could have been mistaken for thunder. But Harold knew better. He had heard that sound before, though not in this quiet corner of town. The rumble grew louder, and the coffee cups on the tables began to vibrate slightly. Other customers looked up from their meals, curiosity and concern mixing on their faces. Sarah posed in her rounds, coffee pot suspended mid-pour, as the sound became impossible to ignore. Even Tommy stepped away from the counter to peer out the window. The rumble transformed into a roar as 5 motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot. Their chrome gleamed aggressively in the morning sun, and their engines seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. The riders were clad in black leather, their faces hidden behind dark visors and windswept bandanas. Harold watched calmly as they dismounted their bikes. His expression remained neutral, but his right hand instinctively moved to touch the Korean War Service medal on his vest, a habit he had developed over decades when sensing trouble. The other customers tried to look busy, suddenly very interested in their meals or phones. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time it wasn't the cheerful greeting it usually offered. Instead, it seemed to sound a warning as the bikers filed in, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. The peaceful morning atmosphere evaporated like dew under a harsh sun. Harold took another sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the best response to an approaching storm was to remain perfectly still. But as the biker's shadows fell across his table, he knew this quiet morning was about to become anything but ordinary. The 5 bikers spread out in the diner like dark clouds before a storm. Their leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, walked straight to Harold's booth. The name Snake was stitched in red on his leather vest, along with patches that marked him as the president of the Road Warriors Motorcycle Club. Sarah stood frozen by the counter, coffee pot clutched tightly in her hands. The other customers tried to make themselves invisible, suddenly finding their breakfast plates fascinating. Only young Tommy from the gas station kept watching, his hand gripping his phone tightly, ready to call for help if needed. Well, what do we have here? Snake's voice was rough, like gravel under tires. He leaned over Harold's table, deliberately invading the old man's space. Looks like we found ourselves a real-life hero. The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Harold continued sipping his coffee, his movements calm and measured, his eyes, sharp despite his age, looked straight ahead, neither challenging nor showing fear. The medals on his vest caught the morning light, drawing the attention of the other bikers. "Check it out, boys," one of the younger bikers said, moving closer. He had spiky blue hair and went by the name Razor. "Grandpa's got himself a whole collection of shiny pins." He reached out to touch one of the medals, but Harold quietly moved his vest away. Snake deliberately bumped the table, hard enough to make Harold's coffee cup rattle in its saucer. Some of the hot liquid spilled over the edge, creating a small brown puddle on the white tablecloth. "Oops," Snake said with a cruel smile. "My bad, old-timer." The other bikers laughed, encouraged by their leader's behavior. They started circling the booth like vultures, making the small corner of the diner feel even more cramped. One of them pulled out his phone, ready to record whatever happened next. "You know what I think?" Snake continued, pulling up a chair and sitting backward on it, his arms resting on the backrest. "I think half these medals are probably fake. I mean, how do we know you didn't just buy them at some army surplus store?" Harold remained silent, but his weathered hands, resting on the table, curled slightly. Years of discipline kept his face neutral, but anyone looking closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "Come on, old man," another biker chimed in. This one had a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. "Tell us about your great war stories, or can't you remember them anymore?" The group laughed again, their voices echoing off the diner's walls. Sarah finally found her courage and started moving toward the table, but Harold caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. She stopped, understanding that he didn't want her to put herself at risk. Snake noticed this silent exchange and grinned wider. "Oh, look at that. The old-timer's trying to protect the waitress. Isn't that sweet?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, deliberately lighting one despite the no smoking sign clearly visible on the wall. The smoke drifted across the table, and Harold finally moved, using his napkin to wave it away from his face. This small action seemed to irritate Snake even more. "What's wrong, hero? A little smoke too much for you to handle?" One of the bikers spotted the old photograph in Harold's wallet, which was sitting on the edge of the table. "Hey, what's this?" He snatched it up before Harold could stop him. The photo showed a much younger Harold in his military uniform, standing proud beside a motorcycle. "Well, isn't this interesting?" the biker said, holding the photo just out of Harold's reach. "Looks like Grandpa used to ride. Bet it wasn't anything like our machines, though. Probably some little scooter, right?" For the first time since the bikers entered, something changed in Harold's expression. A shadow passed over his face, not of fear, but of something else, something that made Snake pause for just a moment. The old veteran's eyes, which had been calm and distant, suddenly focused with an intensity that seemed to make the air in the diner grow thicker. Harold slowly reached for his spilled coffee cup, his movements deliberate and controlled. The morning sun streaming through the window caught his medals again, but this time they seemed to shine with a different kind of light. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds had stopped, as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The old photograph trembled in the biker's rough hands. Harold watched his precious memory being passed around like a cheap playing card, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The image showed more than just a younger version of himself. It captured a moment in history that these young troublemakers couldn't possibly understand. At least, not yet. "Hey, Snake, check this out," Razor called, squinting at the photograph. "The bike in this picture. Something about it looks familiar." He turned the photo sideways, trying to get a better look at the motorcycle partially visible behind young Harold's uniformed figure. Snake snatched the photo, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it with another sneer. "Probably some cheap knockoff," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Harold's hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, began to tremble. But anyone watching closely would have noticed this wasn't the tremor of fear or age. It was the subtle vibration of tightly controlled anger, like the low rumble of a powerful engine waiting to roar to life. "You know what I think?" Snake continued, trying to maintain his commanding presence. "I think our friend here is living in a fantasy world. Old man probably found this photo at a yard sale. He placed the photograph on the table and deliberately placed his coffee cup on top of it, leaving a wet ring on the precious memory." The diner remained silent, but the tension in the air had shifted. The other customers, who had been trying to ignore the scene, were now watching with growing concern. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who usually minded her own business, had stopped pretending to read her magazine. Sarah took a small step forward, coffee pot still in hand. "I think you boys should leave," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The tremor in her words betrayed her fear, but she stood her ground, remembering all the times Harold had been kind to her over the years. Snake turned his head slowly, fixing Sarah with a cold stare. "I don't remember asking for your opinion, sweetheart." His words dripped with menace, causing Sarah to take a step back. That was when Harold moved. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He simply reached out and moved Snake's coffee cup off his photograph. But there was something in the way he did it, a fluid confidence that seemed at odds with his age, that made everyone in the diner hold their breath. "Careful now, old-timer," one of the bikers warned, taking a threatening step forward. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Harold picked up his photograph, gently wiping it clean with his napkin. His movements were precise and controlled, like a man defusing a bomb. The morning sun streaming through the window caught his Korean War medal again, making it gleam like a warning beacon. "Those medals," Snake said, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Why don't you tell us what they're really for? Bet you bought them online, didn't you? Playing dress-up like a kid on Halloween?" The other bikers laughed, but their laughter sounded forced now, uncertain. Something about Harold's continued silence was starting to unnerve them. It wasn't the silence of a scared old man. It was the quiet of a predator choosing its moment. Harold's eyes, which had been focused on cleaning his photograph, slowly lifted to meet Snake's gaze. The young biker found himself staring into eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine, eyes that held stories that would make his worst nightmares seem like children's tales. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees. Even the sizzling from the kitchen had gone quiet, as if the whole world was waiting for what would happen next. Snake tried to maintain his intimidating smile, but it had lost some of its edge. There was something about the old man's steady gaze that made him feel like a child playing at being tough. He shifted in his seat, unconsciously leaning back slightly. Harold carefully tucked his photograph back into his wallet. His trembling hands had gone steady now, and his shoulders, which had been slightly hunched, began to straighten. It was as if years were falling away from him, revealing something that had been hidden beneath the surface of the gentle old veteran. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to either snap or recoil. No one in the diner dared to move or speak. They'd all sensed that whatever was about to happen would shatter the morning's peace like a thunderclap. The old clock on the diner wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching like molasses. Harold's coffee had gone cold, forgotten in the tension of the moment. Snake and his gang watched as the elderly veteran slowly pushed his plate aside, his movements deliberate and controlled. "What's the matter, old man?" Snake's voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Cat got your tum?" The words came out sounding hollow, like a schoolyard bully who was beginning to lose his nerve. Harold's weathered hands moved to his vest, touching each medal one by one. His fingers lingered on a particular medal that none of the bikers recognized, an unusual design that seemed older than the others. The morning sun caught it at just the right angle, revealing an engraving that made Razor squint with sudden interest. "Hey, Snake," Razor whispered, his blue hair falling over his eyes as he leaned closer to his leader. "That medal. I've seen something like it before, in my grandfather's old photos." Before Snake could respond, Harold finally moved. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, he simply stood up. But there was something about the way he rose from his seat that made everyone in the diner catch their breath. His usual stoop disappeared, replaced by the straight-backed posture of a military man. Even Snake found himself taking a step back. "You want to know about these medals?" Harold's voice, when it finally came, was not the weak, trembling sound they had expected. Instead, it carried the weight of authority, the kind that comes from years of commanding respect rather than demanding it. The diner had become so quiet that they could hear the soft clink of dishes in the kitchen. Sarah stood frozen by the counter, her coffee pot forgotten in her hands. Tommy had stopped pretending to eat his breakfast, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. This one, Harold continued, touching the mysterious medal that had caught Razor's attention, was given to me before most of you were born. But it's not a military medal. His blue eyes locked onto Snake's, and for the first time, the biker leader felt a chill run down his spine. Snake tried to maintain his tough facade, but his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "What are you talking about, old man?" Harold's hand moved to his wallet again, but this time he pulled out a different photograph, one that had been hidden behind the first. The paper was yellow with age, its corners worn smooth from years of handling. He placed it carefully on the table, turning it so the bikers could see. The reaction was immediate. Razor's face went pale, and one of the other bikers let out a low whistle. The photograph showed a group of motorcycles lined up outside a bar, their riders standing proud beside them. The bikes were vintage models, but every biker in the diner recognized them instantly. That's impossible," Snake stammered, all pretense of toughness forgotten. "That's the original." The original Hollister meeting, Harold finished for him. July 4th, 1947. I was there. His voice carried no hint of boasting, just the simple statement of fact. "The medal you were mocking. It was given to me by the founding members." The other customers in the diner watched in amazement as the dynamic shifted completely. The tough, intimidating bikers seemed to shrink in their leather jackets, while Harold appeared to grow taller with each passing second. Snake's hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly relaxed. His face showed a mix of emotions, disbelief, embarrassment, and something that looked surprisingly like awe. The snake tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe as he swallowed hard. But that would mean... Razor's voice trailed off, his eyes wide as the realization hit him. Harold nodded slowly, a slight smile finally crossing his face. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made all 5 bikers take another step back, a very old, very worn leather wallet. As it opened, a metal badge caught the light, its brass surface dulled with age, but still clearly showing an emblem that every biker in the room knew by heart. The diner held its collective breath, waiting for Harold to speak again. The next words that would come out of his mouth would change everything. Not just this morning's confrontation, but the entire dynamic between these young riders and the old veteran they had so foolishly chosen to intimidate. The brass badge in Harold's hand seemed to glow in the morning sunlight streaming through the diner windows. Every biker in the room recognized the emblem. A skull with wings, the original design that had inspired countless imitations over the decades. "My full name," Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of history, "is Master Sergeant Harold Iron Hand Thompson. Serial number 14,587, Korean War veteran, and founding member of the original Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, 1948. The effect of his words was immediate and electric. Snake's face drained of all color, making his neck tattoo stand out even more starkly against his skin. Razor dropped into the nearest chair, his legs seemingly unable to hold him up anymore. The other bikers stood frozen, their mouths hanging open in shock. "Iron Hand Thompson?" Snake's voice was barely a whisper. But you're a legend. They said you died years ago." Harold's smile grew slightly wider. "The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated." He carefully placed the badge on the table next to the photograph. "This badge was given to me by Otto Friedli himself, the night we founded the club." Sarah, still standing by the counter, noticed how the bikers' attitudes had completely transformed. They were now looking at Harold with a mixture of awe and embarrassment, like schoolchildren who had just discovered they'd been sassing the principal. For those who don't know their history, Harold continued, his eyes moving from one biker to another. "Otto was the one who started it all. We were all veterans then, looking for the same brotherhood we found in the service." He picked up the old photograph again, pointing to a young man standing proudly beside a gleaming motorcycle. "That's me, age 16, the day I earned my nickname." "Iron Hand," Razor said, leaning forward eagerly. "I heard stories about how you got that name. They say you once held onto a bike's clutch for 4 straight hours during a desert race." Harold nodded, flexing his right hand. Despite his age, the muscles in his forearms still stood out like steel cables. 6 hours actually, through the Mojave. The clutch cable snapped 50 miles in, but we had something to prove that day. The other customers in the diner were watching the scene unfold with fascination. The transformation of the tough bikers into attentive listeners was almost magical. Even Mrs. Rodriguez had put down her magazine, completely absorbed in the unfolding story. "We started something special back then," Harold said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "It wasn't about causing trouble or scaring people. It was about brotherhood, loyalty, and the freedom of the open road." He looked directly at Snake. "Values I learned both in the military and on my bike." Snake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the earlier swagger completely gone from his demeanor. "Sir, we didn't know. We would never have." Harold held up his hand, stopping Snake mid-sentence. "Knowledge comes with time, young man. But respect, that should come naturally." He tapped the military medals on his vest. "These aren't just decorations. Each one represents brothers lost, battles fought, and lessons learned the hard way." Razor had moved closer to examine the old photograph more carefully. Is that a 1936 knucklehead?" he asked, pointing to the motorcycle in the image. A spark of approval flickered in Harold's eyes. "Good eye, son. Built her myself from spare parts. She could outrun anything on 2 wheels east of the Mississippi." He paused, remembering. "Well, except for Wild Bill's Indian chief, but that's another story altogether." The tension in the diner had completely evaporated, replaced by a sense of reverence. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but now it seemed to illuminate not an old man being harassed by bikers, but a living legend sharing his wisdom with the next generation. Sarah finally moved from her spot by the counter, approaching the table with fresh coffee. This time, the bikers respectfully made way for her, some even pulling out chairs to make space. The atmosphere had transformed from confrontation to congregation, with Harold at its center, ready to bridge the gap between past and present. The morning sunlight had shifted in the diner windows, creating a warm glow around the booth where Harold now sat surrounded by his once hostile audience. The bikers had pulled up chairs, that earlier aggression replaced by genuine interest as Harold continued his story. Korea wasn't just about fighting, Harold explained, his fingers tracing the outline of his service medals. It was about keeping your brothers alive. "Every day, we rode motorcycles through terrain that would make your modern bikes cry." His eyes took on a distant look, remembering those dangerous days. Snake leaned forward, his elbows on the table, the snake tattoo on his neck almost forgotten as he listened intently. "You rode bikes in combat, sir?" The word "sir" came naturally now, respect having replaced his earlier mockery. Harold nodded, pulling out another photograph from his wallet. This one showed a line of soldiers on motorcycles, their uniforms dusty and worn. Motorcycle messengers. We carried crucial information between units when radio silence was necessary. The enemy was always listening for radio signals, but they couldn't track a bike moving silent through the hills at night. Sarah brought another round of coffee for everyone, moving quietly so as not to interrupt the story. The other customers in the diner had given up any pretense of eating, all of them now openly listening to Harold's tales. "This mission here," Harold pointed to a specific medal on his vest, "was during the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge. Our unit was cut off, running low on ammunition. The only way to reach them was through a valley the enemy had zeroed in on with artillery." Razor's blue hair fell into his eyes as he shook his head in amazement. "How did you make it through?" A small smile crossed Harold's face. "The same way you handle a tough road today. You read the terrain, trust your machine, and most importantly, you never, ever give up on your brothers." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "I rode through that valley in complete darkness, no headlight, using only the moonlight and what I'd learned from years of night riding with the club." The bikers exchanged glances, a new understanding dawning in their eyes. Their own experiences riding at night suddenly seemed tame in comparison to what Harold had faced. But it wasn't just about the riding, Harold continued, his voice growing thoughtful. "When we started the club after the war, we were all looking for something we'd lost. That sense of brotherhood, purpose, and yes, the adrenaline rush too." He looked at each of the young bikers in turn. "We created a community where being different was accepted, where having your brother's back meant everything." Snake's tough exterior had completely melted away, He reached up and, for the first time that morning, unzipped his leather jacket, revealing a worn t-shirt underneath with the words "Brothers Forever" printed across it. "That's what we're trying to build too, sir. Maybe we just lost our way a bit." Harold nodded understandingly. The spirit of brotherhood isn't about intimidating others or proving how tough you are. It's about standing together, helping each other, and remembering that respect goes both ways. He gestured to his military medals and then to his biker badge. Whether it's on the battlefield or the open road, these symbols mean nothing if you don't live up to what they represent. The morning had grown warmer, and the diner's regular breakfast crowd had started to thin out, but nobody at Harold's table showed any sign of leaving. Young Tommy from the gas station had even abandoned his post to listen from a nearby booth, completely captivated by the stories. "I got something else to show you," Harold said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, worn leather book. "This is the original club rulebook, written in 1948. The first rule might surprise you." The bikers leaned in closer, their eyes wide with anticipation. The morning that had started with intimidation and disrespect had transformed into something none of them had expected. A chance to connect with their own history and understand the true meaning of brotherhood that had started it all. Snake stood up slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and purposeful. The other customers in the diner watched as the tall biker removed his leather jacket, the one that marked him as the Road Warriors' leader. Without saying a word, he carefully draped it over Harold's shoulders. The gesture carried deep meaning in biker culture. It was more than just an apology. It was a sign of absolute respect and acceptance. Harold understood the significance immediately, his weathered hands touching the worn leather with appreciation. "Sir," Snake said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't deserve to wear this jacket until I learn what it truly means to be a leader." The snake tattoo on his neck seemed different now, less threatening and more like a reminder of past mistakes. The other bikers followed their leader's example. Razor removed his bandana, the one he'd worn proudly for years, and placed it on the table in front of Harold. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about the old days," he said quietly. "I never believed them until now. We've forgotten what it really means to be brothers of the road." Sarah watched from behind the counter with tears in her eyes as the scene unfolded. The morning rush had ended, leaving the diner quiet except for the soft conversation at Harold's table. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to witness this unexpected moment of transformation. Harold carefully opened the old rulebook he had shown them earlier. Its pages were yellow with age, but the words were still clear, written in careful handwriting from decades ago. "The first rule," he read aloud, "is simple. Respect is earned, not demanded. A true brother lifts others up, never pushes them down." The words hung in the air like a gentle rebuke to their earlier behavior. Snake's face reddened with shame as he remembered his attempts at intimidation just an hour ago. "We've been doing it all wrong," one of the other bikers admitted, removing his heavy silver rings, the ones he'd worn to make his fists more threatening. "We thought being tough meant making others fear us." Harold shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "Fear is easy to create, but it builds nothing lasting. True strength comes from standing together, helping those who need it, and earning the respect of your community." He gestured to the diner around them. "Every person in this room has their own battles, their own stories. Our job as brothers is to support, not intimidate." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quietly watching everything, suddenly stood up and walked to their table. In her hands, she held a small photo album. "Harold," she said softly, "my late husband used to talk about you. He was in Korea too." She opened the album to show a faded photograph of two young soldiers on motorcycles, and Harold's eyes lit up with recognition. "Miguel Rodriguez," Harold said, his voice warm with memory. "One of the bravest men I ever rode with." He looked up at Mrs. Rodriguez with newfound understanding. "He saved my life twice during that winter campaign." The connection sparked something in the room. Other customers began sharing their own stories of fathers, uncles, and grandfathers who had ridden motorcycles, who had served their country, who had understood the true meaning of brotherhood. Snake listened to it all, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "We want to learn," he said finally, looking at Harold with sincere eyes. "Not just about riding, but about what it really means to be part of this brotherhood. Will you teach us?" Harold looked around the table at the young faces, seeing in them the same hunger for purpose and belonging that he and his brothers had felt so many years ago. The leather jacket on his shoulders felt warm, like an old friend's embrace. "The lessons are all around you," Harold replied, gesturing to his medals, the old photographs, and the rule book. "They're in the stories of those who came before, in the trust of your brothers, and in the respect you show to others." He smiled, seeing the genuine desire for change in their eyes. "But yes, I'll help you remember what we almost forgot." 3 months had passed since that transformative morning at Joe's diner. The bell above the door chimed as it always did, but this time it announced the arrival of a very different group. Harold walked in, surrounded by Snake, Razor, and the other road warriors, all of them smiling and talking like old friends. The regular customers looked up and smiled, now used to this Sunday morning ritual. Sarah already had their usual table ready, the big corner booth where it had all started. The leather jacket Harold wore that first morning now hung in a place of honor on the diner wall, next to the old photographs and his framed military medals. "Your usual, gentlemen?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Every Sunday for the past 3 months, they had come together to share breakfast and stories. The coffee cups were already laid out, steam rising from the fresh brew. Snake, who now preferred to go by his real name, Michael, sat next to Harold. The snake tattoo on his neck was still there, but he had added something new below it, the words "respect" and "honor" in simple script. His whole demeanor had changed, the threatening swagger replaced by quiet confidence. "Harold was teaching us about the mountain run of 52 last week," Razor said excitedly to Sarah. His blue hair was now neatly trimmed, and he wore a clean leather vest with new patches that spoke of community service rather than intimidation. "We're planning to recreate it next month, as a charity ride for the Veterans Hospital." The road warriors had transformed over the past months. Under Harold's guidance, they had redirected their energy into community service. Their weekly rides now included stops at the local children's hospital, where they would let kids sit on their bikes and take pictures. They escorted military funeral processions, standing guard in silent respect. The town that had once feared their arrival now welcomed them. "You boys remember what I told you about the spirit of the ride?" Harold asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. His eyes twinkled with pride as he looked at his newfound brothers. "The journey matters more than the destination," they answered in unison, like students who had learned their most important lesson well. Mrs. Rodriguez walked over to their table, carrying a fresh batch of homemade cookies. "For my favorite Sunday group," she said warmly. Miguel would have been so proud to see this. She had become something of a surrogate mother to the group, sharing her own stories of the old days and her late husband's adventures. Young Tommy from the gas station was now a regular part of their Sunday gatherings too. He had finally bought his first motorcycle, with advice from Harold and mechanical help from the road warriors. They had taught him to ride safely, emphasizing responsibility over recklessness. "Next week," Harold announced, pulling out his old leather book, "I think it's time to share the advanced chapters. You've all proven yourselves ready." The bikers straightened in their seats, honored by the trust this represented. The rule book had become their Bible, its wisdom proving as relevant today as it had been in 1948. The diner had become more than just a meeting place. It was their classroom, their sanctuary, where the old wisdom of the road was passed down to a new generation. The walls now held new photographs alongside the old ones, showing the road warriors at charity events, helping stranded motorists, and standing proud with Harold at veterans' ceremonies. "You know what amazes me most?" Michael said, looking around at his transformed brotherhood. 3 months ago, we thought we were teaching this town about respect by making them fear us. Now we're learning what real respect means, and the town's showing it back to us." Harold nodded, satisfaction evident in his smile. "That's because you've learned the most important lesson of all. Brotherhood isn't about patches or territories or making others small to make yourselves feel big. It's about lifting each other up, standing together through the hard times, and making your community stronger." As the morning sun filled the diner with warm light, the scene was a perfect picture of what Harold had always known brotherhood could be. The tough bikers who had once tried to intimidate an old veteran had become the protectors he knew they could be, carrying forward the true spirit of the road that he and his brothers had established so many years ago. The legacy of Iron Ham Thompson would live on, not just in stories and photographs, but in the actions of these young men who had learned that true strength comes from respect, honor, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood.